Darkrai Giratina has its first poor showing of our metagame. Garchomp as well as Tapu Lele come out ahead, and Decidueye absolutely dominates. Let's go ahead and dive on into all of the details of what happened at our largest Pokemon Pocket tournaments this past weekend. We had almost 3,000 people compete in the largest Pokemon Pocket tournament to date this past weekend, and the starting metagame begins, as you would expect, with Darkrai Giratina at 19.5% as the most played deck. However, our second deck is one that's brand new to these roundups, and that is Tapu Lele Greninja, clocking in at 19% starting playlight. After that, we have a couple of the usual suspects, with Carnivine Crobat clocking in at 8%, Greninja Oricorio at 7.5%, Meowcura Decidui at 7%, and Garchomp Rampardos at 5.5%. Looking at our week-over-week comparisons, we see some pretty big changes from last week's starting metagame. As I mentioned a moment ago, Tapu Lele Greninja wasn't even on the chart, and Meowcura Decidui was present last week, but it was in a slice that was too small to make the pie chart, but it had a 2% play rate, which is a 250% increase to the 7% it was this week. We see Carnivine Crobat and Greninja Oricorio have nominal decreases of around 6%. We see Garchomp Rampardos fall off quite a bit, over 30%, and we see Darkrai Giratina predictably got more popular with its second week in a row of pretty strong results. Looking to our top performing data this week, we see Darkrai Giratina's dominance finally looks to be coming to an end. There were 127 competitors that had 80% win rates or higher during the Swiss rounds of our largest tournament. And if we look at these deck lists as their own grouping, we see that Tapu Lele Greninja was actually the most represented at 25%, which is a 33% increase from its starting distribution. We see Meowcura Decidui has an absolutely dominating performance, increasing at 7% of the starting field up to 22% of our top performers. We see Darkrai Giratina still a sizable amount of the top performers, but that's likely just by sheer volume, as its metagame share actually shrunk by 20% from 19.5 down to 16. We see Garchomp Rampardos had a solid performance this week, increasing from 5.5 up to 8%. And we see Carnivine Crobat as well as Greninja Oricorio both underperforming by solid margins, losing metagame share between our starting and top performing distributions. Digging into some deck list specifics, I want to kick things off with the Meowcura Decidui deck. That's our absolutely most dominating performance this weekend. This is based largely around the fact that against the two most popular decks featuring Giratina, it absolutely crushes, winning over 60% of the time in the hundreds of games that were played during the event. It's also incredibly successful against the Garchomp Rampardos deck that's fairly popular as well. It is worth noting that it does struggle a little bit into the Arceus Crobat deck, since that deck doesn't lean explicitly on EX Pokemon and often has aggressive starts that can run them out before you fully get set up. One granular piece of information that's interesting to note about this Meowcura Decidui deck is that the stats that I have in this video are only covering the variation that was explicitly playing a copy of Dartrix, i.e. the stage 1 in between Rowlet and Decidueye, like the sample list on your screen has. There are actually another 4% of the competitors in this tournament playing very similar decks to this one, but getting rid of that stage 1 for another utility card. And while their performance wasn't negative, like we see things like Darkrai and Giratina be, it was not remotely as overperforming as the variations electing to play this stage 1. This leads me to believe that I would wager a lot of decks in this metagame could stand to benefit from playing a stage 1 as opposed to relying strictly on rare candy. A lot of people have kind of traded those stage 1s out for this card that makes your stage 2s faster. But if you're not playing that rare candy in addition to the stage 1s, you're just faster, not more consistent than you previously were in other metagames, meaning while your stage 2s are still very powerful when they come together, you're still having inconsistency issues that they've always had in Pokemon Pocket. While this Tapu Lele Greninja deck had a solid performance this week, especially being a new deck on the scene, looking into its matchup data, I'm going to be curious to see if it has staying power as the format continues continues to mature. Its matchup into Darkrai Giratina, the other most popular deck in the metagame, is relatively even. It really struggles against Meowcura Decidui, which was the best performer this weekend, thus likely to gain in popularity, and the decks that it has really good matchups against, things like Arceus, Crobat, and Greninja or Oricorio, are likely on the downswing, with their metagame share already shrinking week over week and having relatively limp performances in this weekend's tournaments. Garchomp Rampardo's strong performance this weekend was the most surprising thing to me when I was digging through all the data, and then I got to its matchup tables and all started to make a little bit more sense. While Garchomp Rampardo still struggles against Giratina and Darkrai, it absolutely is dominating this Tapu Lele Greninja Giratina deck that became the second most popular thing played in this weekend's results. It'll be interesting to see where Chomp's position ends up at overall, because while it has a strong matchup there, it's also struggling against Meowscarada Decidueye, and I would wager that one's going to increase in popularity while Tapu Lele Greninja is going to fall off a little bit after the results we're seeing from this weekend. Noteworthy development in Darkrai Giratina this week is that a number of people elected to play the Koala that we saw last week in the most successful list to have counterplay into opposing copies of Oricorio. However, the most successful variations of Darkrai Tina overall were the ones that were just playing 4 basic Pokemon. This seems to make a lot of sense to me looking at our starting metagame distribution, as Oricorio decks were on the downswing overall, and the Koala Bear is likely a liability in a lot of other matchups, so if you're not using it to fry exactly the yellow chicken, it's more of a burden than a help, I would wager. There isn't anything super innovative or insightful to add about the Oricorio Greninja and Carnivine Crobat archetypes that have been putting up consistent results in this metagame, but I wanted to throw the deck lists up here on screen for you so you have something to reference in case you're someone watching this that is not familiar with them. Before we wrap up today, I also wanted to call out a handful of deck lists that were very unique, that had 80+% win rates in the Swiss rounds of this large tournament as well, starting with one featuring an iconic 150 Pokemon, Gengar. Gengar, alongside Tapu Lele and Oricorio, actually had not 1, not 2, but 3 different competitors have deep runs with different variations of it, with the one that's up here on your screen now being the one that I liked the look of the most. I think the idea of being a all-one knockout point Pokemon that sometimes gets really aggressive draws off of rare candy into quick pressure with Gengar, and other times can pressure opposing Giratinas with copies of Tapu Lele, while having Oricorio tie the room together as an efficient hitter when your opponent knocks you out, seems really appealing. Personally, I will definitely be checking out this deck list on the ladder later this week on my live stream, seeing exactly what it can do. In a very similar vein, a Togekiss variation featuring Tapu Lele and Oricorio also made a deep run with a 9-2 finish in the tournament as well. I'll be curious to see as to whether or not the inconsistent skipping your opponent's turn with the sleep effect from Gengar, or the ramping up for additional damage with something like Togekiss, turns out to feel better once I try both of these decks out. Next up, we have a Glade deck list that I'm honestly surprised we haven't seen before this tournament. A competitor went 10-3 with this variation that's very similar to the Garchomp lists we see that are quite popular. You have Glade as your guaranteed lead Pokemon, with Routes being your only normal basic, and then you have 2 Rampardos and a Cranidos alongside the Skull Fossils as your secondary Pokemon line behind this. This allows you to get punchy with the Glade very consistently, very quickly, who with rare candy and first energy advantage starts hitting hard and fast, while Rampardos hits even harder and only gives up 1 knockout point if you need to pivot into it in the games where Glade can't quite carry all on its own. Finally, we had an Infernape deck get on the scoreboard for the first time in a while with a 9-3 finish in the tournament. It's playing 2 copies of Turtonator alongside Kiwawe as a way to accelerate that up really quickly. I think the 1-2 punch of Infernape allowing you to clear out EX Pokemon in a really efficient fast hit, and Turtonator clearing out things like Oricorio as well as other things, with Kiwawe letting you hit for 90 damage very quickly, is a very appealing thing to be doing in our current metagame. these fire Pokemon also feel like they could be in a decent spot if we're going to be seeing more Meowscaradas running around. I'm going to be honest, I was pretty pleasantly surprised to pour through the tournament data this week and see Darkrai Giratina, while plenty popular, not the format dominating, unstoppable powerhouse that many of us thought it was going to be after the first couple of weeks. While I don't expect it's going to disappear altogether, it's good to know we have some solid tools like Meowscarada to reach for if we really want to be beating this big bad. As always, if you enjoyed my roundup here today, I'd ask that you please smash that like button to hopefully help it reach some more people. If you happen to be new here and you enjoy data-driven deck roundups like this one, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the coverage that we're going to have of things in the future. As always, I appreciate everybody that made it all the way through to the end of the video, and I hope your next pack is an excellent one.